Welcome to Cover from the World Affairs Councils of America. I'm guest host Patrick Ryan, president of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Today, we will have a terrific conversation with Carla Power about her book, Homeland Security. First, let me remind you of a great opportunity to experience the world in a few days in Washington. The World Affairs Councils of America annual conference in person is set for November 16 to 19 at the world famous Mayflower Hotel. You can get all the details, speakers, agenda, and registration information at wacaconference2021.org. That's WACA conference2021.org, and we'll see you there. Carla Power is a journalist and author who writes for Time, and her writing has also appeared in Newsweek, Vogue, Glamour, the New York Times Magazine, and Foreign Policy. Her work has earned her an Overseas Press Club Award and a Women in Media Award. Carla's last book, If the Oceans Were Ink, An Unlikely Friendship and Journey to the Heart of the Quran, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And her new book is Homeland Security, Deradicalization, and the Journey Back from Extremism. Welcome, Carla Power, to the World Affairs Councils of America, Cover to Cover.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be talking to you.
Let's start with just a little bit of your background and what your experiences have been that led you to reporting and writing on this particular topic, extremism and militancy in groups around the world.
Well, I started off, I sort of grew up partly in the Midwest, mostly in the Midwest, with years in the Mideast and Central Asia. My father was a law professor who was absolutely fascinated with Islamic societies. So I spent years in basically every place that is now making headlines, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Egypt, and Rome, and then the rest of my childhood in St. Louis, Missouri. And so I got very interested in how cultures see each other, because I was always shuttling between American suburbia and then these outposts that my father would take us to. And went on to study Orientalism in literature as an undergraduate, and then got interested in how non-Muslim societies write and talk about Muslim societies. So my first book, I was a foreign correspondent at Newsweek and wrote a lot about Muslim societies there. And then transitioned to a freelance career and to books. And my first book, If the Oceans Were Ink, was, the plot is that I studied the Quran for a year with a traditional Islamic scholar. But the real quest was to sort of see where I, as American secular, but with a Jewish mother and a Quaker father, feminist journalist. And so where my worldview and where the worldview of a very conservative, traditionally trained in a madrasa, Muslim sheikh from a tiny village in India, and where our worldviews intersect and where they diverge. And we are still fast friends and found a really surprisingly sort of spacious common ground, I would say. You would think that we were poles apart, but happily, I discovered lots of overlap in the ways we looked at the world. And it was with the 2016 election when I sort of found, our own country, even though I lived in England for over 20 years, I go back to the States a lot and certainly write for American publishers and so on. And so I was back in the States in Texas and was amazed at how polarized and antagonistic the public discourse had become. And it occurred to me that, you know, it was all very well for me to sit with a quietist, pious, kind of egghead sheikh, a bookish man, rather like myself in many ways, and to see where our worldviews might overlap. But as long as I've been writing about Islam, I'd get questions from friends or audience members about, why is there so much terrorism? What is this thing about jihad? And I, of course, would bat away those questions. I sort of didn't want to deal with that. All I wanted to talk about was what I knew was true, which is the vast majority of Muslims are quietist and peaceful, and the real meaning of jihad is struggle, and the most important jihad, said the Prophet, is the struggle against your own negative impulses, and so on. But I really wasn't dealing with, the real issues that seem to plague Muslim societies of militant Islamist activity. And it suddenly occurred to me, okay, I should really look at this and dig down and try to chip away at the stereotype of a Muslim, of Muslim militancy, of jihadi terrorism, and see what I found. And because I wanted to look at dynamic issues, I wanted to see, how sturdy the truism that once a terrorist, always a terrorist held up. And so I started talking to the families of militants, the militants themselves, and also a whole range of people from, psychotherapists to parole officers to deradicalization experts who were working with former militants to try to lead them sort of back to make them renounce violence and leave it behind. So that's how I got into this.
Let me share with our audience again that your first book is If the Oceans Were Ink, and this was your Pulitzer Prize finalist book. And I'll just read one citation here. For all those who wonder what Islam says about war and peace, men and women, Jews and Gentiles, this is the book to read. It is a conversation among well-meaning friends, intelligent, compassionate, and revealing, the kind that needs to be taking place around the world. And that was Fareed Zakaria, the CNN anchor. Terrific book, and you explored many subjects of conventional wisdom that we all kick around in our conversations about global terrorism, visits to madrasas, and as you mentioned, talking and getting close to a cleric who was a scholar in Islamic law and theory. Any particular episode from that book before we get into Homeland Security, your visits and your explorations on the topic?
For me, what is so extraordinary, Sheikh Akram and I were colleagues initially. I was, right after grad school, I went to the Islamic Center, the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, and we worked together on a project. And for me, Sheikh Akram's biggest contribution to, contemporary discourse is something he stumbled on. About 20 years ago now, we were having tea and he said, "Oh, Carla, you're interested in women's issues. I'm gonna do a biography of women religious scholars." And he's like, I'll do, there may be 40 or 50 women. It'll be a slim volume. And it should take me, a few months sort of thing. And of course, he had been a specialist in hadith. He is a specialist in hadith, the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad that are one of the cornerstones for the Sharia, for the Islamic kind of way of life. And so he started looking and he started looking in texts, and 15 years later, he has found over 10,000 women scholars, stretching back to the 14th century. And, you know, this completely remakes what we think of when we think of an Islamic scholar. I mean, you know, even now I think of a gray bearded guy, you know, sitting in judgment kind of thing. I mean, that's, and I admit I put my hand up, even though intellectually I know this is not the case. But Sheikh Akram found, by going and literally looking in the margins of books, looking in travel books, looking in mosque and madrasa, you know, rosters, and he found, you know, women doing things like, there was one woman in the 8th century, and you knowing Saudi Arabia much better than I do now, know that women are certainly not allowed near the Prophet's grave right now. They're kept outside. There was one woman teacher who was teaching men and women together, which again, in a contemporary Muslim society is totally frowned on, teaching caliphs, teaching other famous scholars. And she was so revered that she taught her classes leaning on the Prophet's grave, right near his headstone. And, you know, it's women who are issuing fatwas, a 14th century Samarkand woman who not only wrote her own religious judgments or fatwas, but as a judge, but also wrote her more famous, but possibly less talented husband's fatwas, and woman after woman coming through. So this really shed a light on a whole hidden history of Islamic scholarship, and really sort of gives the lie to the notion that Islamic scholarship is, an Islamic authority is an all-male affair. And this would have been important if anybody had found it. But the fact that this guy is so traditional and traditionally trained and rather small c conservative makes it that much more powerful. And it's really exciting because he is it's now 40 volumes long, this dictionary of women scholars. And you can get like a little like taster of it. There's a 1-volume book you can get on Amazon that he wrote in English, but it was just published in Arabic in 40 volumes. And he's really hopeful that it will, you know, change people's minds about women's ability to speak up and engage in religious discourse.
Let's move on to your new book, Homeland Security, a terrific new addition to the literature on deradicalization and the journey back from extremism. And let me remind our audience, we invite your questions. We want to hear what you have to say and what you'd like to ask Carla Power. So please start putting your questions in the Q&A tab on the Zoom screen. Carla, tell us a little bit about your search for the sources of extremism. You were looking to identify what it is that makes not just Islamic militants, but around the world we see the rise of militancy at home and abroad. But you looked at kind of the underpinnings of what leads people to be involved in these militant movements. So give us the premise for your book.
Well, I started off by thinking, okay, we so rarely, I mean, at least as a journalist, you so rarely talk about the absolute root causes for people to be drawn into militancy. We only really seem to talk about terrorists when they're on the run or when some horrible tragic event has occurred. So I wanted to go behind the headlines and look at sort of these people as dynamic human beings who were led into terrorism and in some cases left it behind. So I started off by going and meeting with the mothers of a lot of young men and a couple women who went off from Europe and one from Canada to join the Islamic State. And that was a real eye-opener, of course, because, you know, when I went to meet the first mother up in Birmingham in the UK, and, you know, I was like, who possibly could be, and this was right after, you know, there were very, very fresh headlines of the really savage brutality of the Islamic State's at least propaganda and their routine, their regime, which was, of course, by design. I mean, they very much went into a sort of let's shock and awe the world, and, you know, let's show them how, you know, they want barbarians, we'll show them barbarians. I mean, that certainly was a tactic. But I got up to Birmingham and talking to this mother, you know, I was expecting a really, you know, scary guy. And instead, I got a naive who had, you know, wanted to help kids in Syria and sort of backed into, you know, was obviously groomed. And this was the first time I had heard the term groomed linked to joining a terror group, and now a lot of people in those circles talk about grooming as something recruiters do. And he ended up, you know, in the Islamic State, and, you know, was such a sort of young soul, a kind of Peter Pan figure, that one of the things he did was call his mother to ask permission if he could ride his commander's motorbike, because he was worried. He ran off to the Islamic State, but he was worried that his mom would get angry at him because he had gone on a motorbike without a helmet. But the more I started looking, you know, that every area seems to have different reasons for wanting to join. When I went to Pakistan, the reasons that people were lured into these groups or decided to join these groups was of course very different from Denmark or Germany. And so I sort of came home thinking, look, just as all politics is local, all extremism is local. You really have to really dig down into the local soil to figure out what is driving these people. And I was disabused of a whole range of notions. I mean, the idea that there is mental illness in any larger sense of in the militant population than in the regular population is simply not true. These are, as one Indonesian de-radicalizer told me, these people are, and I won't sully that. He used a term I won't use, but he's like, these people are normal and they go into it for normal reasons. And these can range from anger at corruption, anger at authorities, a search for, you know, in countries where legitimate political dissent is all but squeezed out by autocrats or dictators, you know, joining groups that are seen as militants or even declared as terrorist groups is one way for people who want to be politically active can see themselves be politically active. That's sort of not as much in the West. In the West, I think there are issues of integration, of feeling pushed out of mainstream culture. There's a wish to belong, a wish to transcend, to believe in a transcendent future, and the seductiveness of a golden past.
Yeah, let me ask, in your journey with the Sheikh and your exploration abroad and talking with many people, tell us a little bit about the incompatibility of groups like Daesh, the Islamic Jihad, the barbarism, mainstream Muslims, and you correctly point out that 99.9% of the 1.3 billion Muslims on the planet are peaceful and they believe in the Quran, and that Islam is a peaceful religion and following. And how is that? How has that been rationalized by extremists, that they Islamist extremists, and we're going to talk about the full range of militancy. How are the teachings of Islam rationalized by groups like Daesh?
Well, I mean, they do have their own scholars who are legitimizing the sense that, but that there certainly is a really strong argument. When you look at someone like bin Laden, all he wanted was, all in quotations, what he was demanding was that U.S. troops leave Saudi Arabia. This was, when you dig down to some of these demands, I mean, they were played out horribly, and I'm not in any way excusing the actions. But when you talk to a young kid and say, look, we are going to build a new caliphate where we can live, nobody is going to, make you feel like a second-class citizen. We will live according to Islam. And we will be able to, I mean, in a sense, they're kind of aping the nation state, right? So they're kind of taking a page from 19th century organization of the world. We will build our own, I mean, they call it a caliphate, but we will build our own country effectively. And the problem, but also the richness of the Islamic tradition is that you can pretty much, I mean, much like the Bible, you can find the Bible and Christian teachings, you can find whatever you want. I mean, there will be some scholar at some point in time, maybe when the Mongols descended onto Baghdad in the 12th century and it was a crisis situation, you will be able to find a fatwa or a religious opinion that can legitimize anything. So
right. I think that's a common denominator in the religious tracts of almost every religious organization, that exactly. There are things that are part of doctrine that don't belong in the 21st century. We're going to take some questions here soon, but Carla, let's explore a little bit outside the Islamist phenomenon in terms of militancy. You've explored the concept of extremism across the board, and in your book you mentioned that Germany is one of the areas where the most profound sorts of extremism are rearing its ugly head. Tell us what you found in Western societies and in the extremist movements that we're coming to see.
There definitely, Germany has, for obvious reasons, since they and this is Western Germany in particular before reunification, wrote into its constitution, we will not allow extremism to come into power by democratic means or anything. So from the get-go, there has been a real attempt to stamp it out on a legislative and constitutional level. What happened post reunification is there was an upsurge in right-wing extremism, and particularly from the East, partly because, all sorts of reasons. But Germany has responded by, throwing a lot of money at prevention and de-radicalization programs. There are, over last count, like 720 de-radicalization programs that come at, for both Islamist jihadis and also for right-wing extremists.
And you were telling me that there's even a new vocabulary in Germany associated with the various stages and structures.
Absolutely. Yes, they're incredibly long words that I wish, like Verang, pedagogy of irritation theory. Irritation theory is the idea that you say you're working with a neo-Nazi. This one guy was telling me about how he was working with a neo-Nazi youth, and the idea is to irritate them, just slightly, to scratch that sheen of the worldview by making them think. So this guy, I think I was telling you the other day, was working with a young man who was saying, "Oh, I think we should round up all Muslims in Germany and take them to a camp." And Nico, who is a very experienced guy in the anti neo-Nazi space, was saying, okay, so how are you exactly going to do that? Are you just going to knock on their doors and try to get them onto the trains, or how is that going to work? And he forced the young man to go through the very logical steps. And the young man's like, well, maybe I won't drag them to the trains. And then Nico said, okay, well, so somebody else would drag them. Okay, so how are you going to be involved? And the young man said, well, maybe I would drive the train. So, and Nico's like, so you're going to drive all these German citizens to their deaths? Well, maybe I won't do that. Maybe. And so, and in other words, dragging him in a very logical, methodical way through his atrocious fantasy, and making him see, trying to make him see sense. That and they're endless. The Germans have been really doing really interesting things with, there's a huge youth subculture idea where you try to drag these kids back through punk or through skateboarding or through talking about male and female roles or through graffiti classes. And so that because they're so well funded, and because people are assigned mentors for years and years and years, and they're committed to the long haul, these programs, many of them. But unfortunately, I mean, not to say that they are successful. I mean, we're still right. Seeing a huge rise up, in the military, in the police force, and in society at large. There has been a swerve to the right over the last decade in mainstream public discourse. So that is very worrying, and people are weary, of what I keep hearing from these folks who work with neo-Nazis is, we're so tired of feeling guilty, and we're so right. Can we please move on now?
So we've identified the sources of radicalism: loss of trust in common good, loss of respect and authority, suspicion of the public sphere, and I think you've mentioned that all this is supercharged by social media, and in some cases isolation, people sitting in front of their computer, and now de-radicalization process is necessary, but much more difficult to accomplish. And in your book, you set out some great examples. I think you were talking about one case where someone told you it's easier and more acceptable to punish radicals than to try to rehabilitate them. So I guess different societies are grappling with this in different ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I should also add that you gave a perfect description of the main things that are driving people in the West. But I would say in a place like I went to Pakistan and Indonesia, and in those places, the reasons for people being drawn into it is very different. Often there's when there's widespread corruption or widespread poverty, or huge societal inequalities. People on the ground are drawn into it. And there are also sort of other inequalities. I was really interested, I was talking to a woman who worked with Boko Haram, trying to de-radicalize folks in Nigeria. and get them out of Boko Haram. And she said that actually a lot of women were joining, because when you get a guy, when you get a Boko Haram militant coming by and saying, and these are in villages where these women would have been married at 8 or 9, they wouldn't have had the right to divorce their husbands. And this is not Islam, this is just local custom, and basically their lives were domestic at 8 or 9. And you get a Boko Haram recruiter coming by and saying, hey lady, if you come with me, you could be my wife. You could have a slave, you could have a job, you could make bombs, or you could sit at a roadside and, tick boxes, whatever you want. That kind of lifestyle sounds a lot more appealing if you're going to be, when you're in a tiny village where you're there as a wife and mother and nothing else. And the interesting thing was, this woman who started Nigeria's deradicalization program said, because of that issue, women were a lot harder to de-radicalize than men, because of course men could leave Boko Haram behind and they had, society was going to give them freedoms, but women had too much to lose when they had nothing to go back to effectively.
Sure.
They left. So I guess my bigger point is that all sorts of inequalities and holes in a society, if you want to see why militants join, look at the injustices, or look at the holes in society that would allow them to, that would drive them there. And whether it's sexism, corruption, or fiscal inequality, as it is in Pakistan, that is one reason.
Well, you talked about Al-Qaeda, and certainly within Saudi Arabia, the Al-Qaeda movement was claiming corruption by the House of Saud and betrayal of Islam, and that was certainly the roots of that conversation. Turning to our question from our attendee today, an anonymous question, Carla. It goes back to your book, If the Oceans Were Ink, and it says your description of meetings with the sheikhs sound interesting. In meeting with and interviewing a range of people, including those who have influence and who may hold extremist views, excuse me, how do you ensure that you are not co-opted into their views of the world? I guess it's the old saw that diplomats get too close to the people that they're associated with in a foreign country and adopt some of their perspectives and insights, or kind of a mini Stockholm syndrome that you may take the views and lose some objectivity. How do you answer that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a risk when you in any journalistic project, when you go out and seek to understand, if not condone, what someone is doing. I mean, certainly, it was very, very important to me in this, certainly in Homeland Security, to continually looking at my lenses. Where was I complicit in promoting these people's worldviews? Is that irresponsible? Isn't it? On the other hand, these are voices that are so rarely heard, that I felt it was important to amplify them and to write about them. And I think, I think there's enough self-doubt in Homeland Security in particular, even more so than If the Oceans Were Ink. I think self-doubt about how one reports on often heinous crimes, how one talks about these issues, that I certainly don't feel held hostage by any of these people. I didn't develop a friendship with any of them in the way that I very honestly did with the sheikhs. So, so it's a different kind of book in that sense. But throughout, I'm proud, and I'll put my hand up and say my quest was to understand and to amplify their voices, because I think, yeah.
And I suppose in your journalistic training, you've come to accept the notion that your writing will be, it could be under critical review, and you have to be able to stand up and provide evidence of what your conclusions are. I've noticed that in conversations in World Affairs Council programs, especially in the polarized environment that we all live in now, even if you try to be nonpartisan but objective in analyzing the position of this or that president, you can be charged with partisanship or politicization, even though you're trying to be objective and you can demonstrate the facts. So I suspect that's part of the journalistic quest, is to continue that objectivity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a real skeptic when it comes to objectivity. I mean, I just don't. With the you know, there are facts, and as journalists, we are charged, journalists and you know, think tank, we are charged with promoting facts. But there are a lot of facts out there, and the facts that get chosen for the front of the New York Times and the Washington Post are very different facts from the facts that of usually from what's going on the ground in Waziristan. So it's a question of framing, and I wanted to move the frame someplace else. That doesn't mean it's I've been taken hostage by it. It just means that I think the importance of turning our gaze away from ourselves and then back again to ourselves, because I think a lot of the ways that terror is reported has much more to do with us than with quote unquote them.
Right. Let's turn to a question from Belinda in Alaska. Belinda asks, in trying to de-radicalize young people, what's the hardest thing to overcome, both for the person and for the change maker?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it depends. It depends on where you are, but over and over again, I was told that it was a long process. The ideal de-radicalization effort should be multi-pronged. It should be teams of people who tap into the individual's needs. You know, if somebody got into, you know, jihadi militancy because of some theological fervor, then they should have an imam working with them. If they went in because they were lonely, there are other mechanisms or so on. So I think I think it's the commitment, and you know, in our country, certainly, partly for very, you know, understandable reasons. I mean, you know, we are not a country that, you know, the government is not meant to mess with people's minds, you know, and we have the First Amendment, and nobody wants to touch religious freedoms. Nobody wants to touch people's rights to think as they wish, so long as that doesn't mean fomenting violence, obviously. But I think that's one very sound and very American reason that we have been slow and nervous about getting into rehabilitation work in any real sense. You go to France or you go to Saudi Arabia, where they have no problem saying, you know, this is what the state thinks is a normal human being, and we are going to pour money into. I'm sure Pat has much more insight into that in terms of Saudi than I do. But you know, there are other countries where you know, it's like, we're gonna work with these people, and we're gonna work with them in no uncertain terms. I mean, in France, you've got, you know, for a while you had these schools where it was very short-lived, but they set up sort of schools where they would send people who were at danger of militancy, who, you know, and they'd be taught French culture, you know, the history of the French Revolution. They'd have to stand up and sing La Marseillaise. It did not work out. They were soon declared a disaster in the French Senate. But, you know, that's sort of kind of hardcore mass kind of groupthink is bad. So well, I think, yeah.
I'm sorry. In the Saudi context that you referred to, I think they've had mixed results. They use both carrots and sticks. They locked up members of the Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula who were threatening the kingdom, especially in the 2003 to 2007 era. They had a very harsh crackdown, but they did try to rehabilitate many of those members with mixed results. But they would bring them into facilities where there would be counseling. They would bring in the families. They would introduce them to prospective spouses, give them money and jobs. And some were brought back from that lifestyle, but there were some who returned to Al Qaeda and continued bombing. There was one case where somebody set off a bomb standing next to the Minister of Interior, who had been through one of these rehabilitation cases. So it's a mixed result. Let me ask you, with the question from Margaret of California, are there any common characteristics of the radicals involved? And we haven't really talked about US radicalism much, even though that's something that's been on your mind. The January 6th attack on Congress, what common characteristics, if any, do you see with radicals from the Middle East and elsewhere around the world?
I mean, I think the parallels for people who join these groups, there's a hunger for brother and sisterhood, for belonging, for a need to have a cause, to have something to fight for that is bigger than yourself. That you see when you talk to both kinds of radicals. There's an incredibly prescient review of Mein Kampf by George Orwell, published in 1940. And he read Mein Kampf and said, we like to think that if we give all citizens, warm beds, warm showers, good health care, good contraception, jobs for life, that there will be no more radicalism. There will not be an appeal of extremism. And he's like, and yet you look at the rise of Hitler and you see that people want parades and they want to sacrifice themselves for something. They want something bigger than themselves. And that kind of yearning, I think, is really there and deserves some attention, that we need to think about that when we're looking at both kinds of extremisms. Let me just mention, Carla, you bring up the rise of the Third Reich. There was also the element of the other, that the German society was aggrieved, and they put it clearly on the doorstep of Jews and others. And I think similarly, we're seeing a white supremacy movement that's fueling the rise of radicalism in the United States. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, the construction of others just seems to grow and grow, where it was Muslims a couple of years ago, the thing that we are now dealing with, of course, is this mass disinformation program that we've seen in recent weeks. Is a real problem with some of these social media companies, and that kind of marbling disinformation into the bloodstream. I have no answers for that, but that seems to me to be, and certainly jihadi groups have used that too. I mean, there was, right. Pakistan, they've definitely used it, not in terms of social media, but in terms of radio stations and so on. So that I think is absolutely a parallel. You're told to hate long enough and you start hating. Right. Let's go through a couple of questions. We have about 14 minutes remaining in the program today. And this comes from Richard in Cleveland. What do you believe could be the next step to refresh global collaboration and cooperation? You've seen law enforcement and social entities involved in dealing with radicalism and extremism. What in the context of international organizations or methodology could be applied to increase cooperation? Oh my goodness. I mean, there is a lot of cooperation already. I mean, I look, I've sat through conferences where Interpol has talked about, how Europe is combining and there has been, certainly when faced with a foreign threat like the Islamic State or in the early days of Al Qaeda. I, what I see in terms of real leadership is happening on the local level. It's not happening on, I mean, we're getting ready for leaders to gather for the real existential threat. Terrorism, I refuse to see as an existential threat. Climate change, I do. And even then, there doesn't seem to be much, there's internal squabbling. And so my real hope is that that on local levels, people will find leaders such as an amazing leader in Belgium who has turned his town around and has managed to take a town with a history of really big support for far right groups, and a town that was on the richest scene for Islamic State fighters in the Western world, just outside of Brussels. And nobody left for the Islamic State because of what this guy was doing to try to de-radicalize both, or not de-radicalize, but to try to bring both the far right and potential jihadis and make them feel part of the town together. Right. And that kind of leadership, I think, is I mean, the mind boggles it. It really is above my pay grade to think of what international cooperation would be. But I think, having serious talks about thinking about terrorism with a different lens besides the security lens, I think would be a good start. And certainly the UN has started that. I mean, they definitely are fully aware of push issues and pull issues and the social context that often drives people into extremism, social and political context.
Christopher in Cleveland asks, and we talked about this a little bit, but what more can you add to his question? Thinking of society stability and cohesion, how big a long-term threat is Trump-style, quote, my country first, unquote, nationalism? And this isn't just in America, it's in places like Hungary and elsewhere.
Exactly. I think it's incredibly, it's really, really potent. If you see rising inequality, if you see governments not delivering to their citizens sound futures, a sense of rule of law, a sense of, I think the populace will win if there's not, you look at the United States, there are so many people who are so disillusioned with the system, both political and economic, that if we're not careful, we're going to have people floating off. Well, we already are. I think it's tremendously difficult. I think it's not something I study more closely than anybody else who reads the New York Times and Washington Post, but absolutely.
Right. Well, the impact of nationalism around the world is more than just the Trump style. There's this new wave around the world that's leading some regimes to establish this nationalistic perspective on things.
I'm still, I thinking here in Britain of the dangerous braiding together of entertainment and politics, which reached its apotheosis in Boris Johnson, who has taken being like a clown, so that people don't take him all that seriously, and he looks to have really cemented his position through this. I think there are all sorts of reasons that populism is dangerously attractive now, and people have to push back against it.
In the European context, a lot of the nationalistic fervor extends from the migration, the mass migration from Africa and the Middle East. It doesn't look like that's slowing down. And indeed, we're looking at increased migration from climate change, civil wars, et cetera. So I don't know that we're going to see this situation improve much.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Let me share with you a question from Michael in Cincinnati. He wants to know what World Affairs Councils might be able to do to assist in this area. And I guess this area is addressing the question of people becoming radicalized. And I suspect some of it is having conversations about what these issues are and how they affect people. But what do you think?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I mean, I think there are real spaces for, engaging people who are formers to get them to, I mean, I'm a journalist, but there's some incredibly articulate people who have actually, been militants, both neo-Nazi and jihadi. And, they talk very, I'm thinking of two people in particular who would make great speakers. And they talk about, I mean, I was talking to the former neo-Nazi who is a mother of 8, and for her, behind most right-wing groups is trauma, is psychological trauma. She sees that as really a cornerstone for most people's journeys into it. And so I think almost, the World Affairs Council, I know you discuss geopolitics usually, but if the conversation can include these sorts of concepts and of talking to people who, have struggled with dynamism and change. That's certainly one way. There are also groups that feel tremendously sort of unsupported, in part because they're viewed very suspiciously by groups that they might have tried to help. So one of the problems, for example, in Minneapolis, where I visited, where there was the first and pretty much only serious de-radicalization case of a young man who was trying to join the Islamic State. And, groups that had received CVE funding from Washington were viewed with extreme suspicion by the Somali communities who had seen a lot of folks leave both for al-Shabaab and for the Islamic State. And that kind of mutual suspicion came out of, I hate to say it, but came out of the securitized environment that came out of 9/11. So I think really trying to understand these dynamics would be a huge service to folks who are interested in global geopolitics. So we've got to turn the lens on ourselves and look at, and books are coming out about the, Spencer Ackerman and
Sure.
various other people are looking at this in much greater depth than I am.
Carla, let me ask you, refer a question from Edward, and this is getting back into some of the details of sources of radicalism. He asks how much of Islamic militancy can be traced back to the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, the Gulf states, and their funding of madrasas around the world. And you've written about madrasas in India and elsewhere. He asks about Pakistan, and that it's now become very hardline, and even around the world in places like Kosovo, there's rising fundamentalism that can be traced back to Gulf state money. Do you look at all at societies that are supporting radicalization?
I don't in this book, but I think you've hit on an absolutely important problem. I mean, 2 generations ago, I almost think of it about it's like biodiversity. Islamic practices and beliefs and modes of being were much more diverse before the Wahhabization of the world. I sort of almost think of it as a kind of globalization drive by mostly the Saudis. And Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was such a huge push in the 70s and 80s of Wahhabi beliefs, and that could be anything from all sorts of Qurans with particular translations of particular surahs, of particular verses that were much more hardline than other translations or so on, or the stamping out of Sufi beliefs in Pakistan with the rise of Wahhabi influenced clerics, whether it's scholarships for people to come study in Saudi Arabia, and the loss of all sorts of other gentler, kinder interpretations of how to practice the Islamic faith. So yes, I absolutely think that has a lot to do with it. It also has to do.
Edward, there's your answer. The answer is yes. And I wish we had more time to get into this, because there's really a rich field of conversation, especially Saudi Arabia. But we are about out of time. And Carla, thank you so much for your conversation today. And in answer to the question, what can World Affairs Councils do to assist? I would suggest that they talk to you via probably Casey at WACA about arranging for you to come and talk from your home in Brighton to them via Zoom, perhaps, about your book, Home, Land, Security. We don't want to confuse it with an analysis of the US government. And If the Oceans Were Ink. Terrific books. I commend you all to read them, and World Affairs Councils to contact Carla to arrange a visit. Again, Carla, thank you so much for being with us today.
Real pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for really great thought-provoking questions. And thanks for having me.
We have some wonderful people out there who are interested in this topic, among many other things. Well, that does it for this edition of Cover to Cover, the World Affairs Councils of America session to talk with authors about their books that impact on global affairs and international relations. We've been talking with Carla Power, an author and journalist, and really a thought-provoking conversation. So thanks to the World Affairs Councils of America for having me as the host. And remember the conference coming up, go to WACAconference2021.org, and we will see you at the next edition of Cover to Cover.